The blood on Violet Kingsley's pale hands glistened in the harsh Arizona sun, as she struggled to pull herself from the rocky ravine where her horse had thrown her. The terrifying realization that she was alone in this vast wilderness beginning to set in. It had been foolish to take the shortcut through the canyon, especially with storm clouds gathering on the horizon, but Violet had been determined to reach Jerome before nightfall. Her uncle's letter had been urgent. The family's silver mine was failing, and he needed her accounting skills if there was any hope of saving it from the creditors circling like vultures. After finishing her education back east, Violet had promised her late father she would help run the family business when needed, but she never imagined returning west under such desperate circumstances. Now here she was, her horse long gone, her dress torn and bloodied, and her ankle twisted so badly she could barely put weight on it. The fall from the narrow trail had sent her tumbling nearly 20 feet down the rocky slope. Her hands were scraped raw from trying to break her fall, and a deep gash ran along her left calf where it had caught on a jagged rock during her descent. "Help!" Violet called, her voice sounding thin and feeble against the vastness of the canyon. "Is anyone there?" The only answer was the distant rumble of thunder. Tears of frustration and pain welled in her eyes as she assessed her situation. Jerome was still miles away, and with her injuries, she'd never make it before the storm hit. Her supplies were in her saddlebags, now carried off by her spooked horse. The sensible thing would be to find shelter and wait, but shelter was scarce in this barren landscape. Violet tore a strip of fabric from her petticoat and attempted to bind her bleeding leg. Her fingers trembled as she worked, partly from pain and partly from the growing fear that she might die out here, alone and forgotten. She had just finished tying off the makeshift bandage when the sound of hoofbeats reached her ears. Her heart leaped with hope as she looked up to see a rider appearing at the top of the ravine. "Down here," she called, waving frantically. "Please help me." The rider halted abruptly, then dismounted with practiced ease. Even from this distance, Violet could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, with a worn leather hat pulled low over his face. A cowboy, by the look of him, with a gun holstered at his hip and a worn duster flapping around his legs in the rising wind. "Madam," he called back, his voice deep and cautious. "You hurt?" "I fell," Violet replied, gesturing to her bloodied leg. "My horse bolted and I can't walk." The man surveyed the ravine, quickly finding a path down to her. He descended with the nimble confidence of someone who knew this terrain well, occasionally sending small avalanches of pebbles skittering down before him. As he drew closer, Violet could see his face beneath the shadow of his hat weathered by sun and wind, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. His eyes, however, were a startling clear blue, assessing her with concern. "That's a nasty cut you've got there," he said, kneeling beside her to examine her leg. "And these canyon walls are no place to be with a storm coming." "I was trying to reach Jerome," Violet explained, wincing as he gently probed around her ankle. "Jerome's still a good 4 hours' ride," he replied, shaking his head. "And this ankle looks sprained. You won't be walking on it any time soon." Thunder rumbled again, closer this time, and the man glanced up at the darkening sky. "We need to get you someplace safe." "My ranch is about an hour from here. Can you ride?" Violet nodded, though uncertainty flashed across her face. "I think so, but my belongings, we'll look for your horse later," he said firmly. "Right now, we need to beat that storm." Without further discussion, he slipped one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. Violet gasped, automatically looping her arms around his neck to steady herself. "I'm Kurt Keller," he said as he carefully negotiated the uneven ground back toward his horse. "And you are," Violet Kingsley, she replied, acutely aware of the impropriety of their position but lacking any alternative. My uncle owns the Kingsley silver mine in Jerome. A flicker of recognition crossed Kurt's face. Elias Kingsley's your uncle, you know him. Everyone around these parts knows the Kingsley mine. Something in his tone suggested there was more to it than that, but he didn't elaborate. They reached his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that stood patiently awaiting their return. With surprising gentleness for a man of his size, Kurt set Violet upon the saddle, then swung up behind her. "Hold on tight," he instructed, placing her hands on the saddle horn before reaching around her to take the reins. "Storm's getting closer." Violet stiffened at the proximity, but as they began to move, the pain in her leg flared, and she found herself leaning back against his solid chest for support. The first drops of rain began to fall as they rode out of the ravine, quickly turning from a sprinkle to a downpour that drenched them both. Kurt urged his horse into a canter, one arm circling Violet's waist to keep her secure as they rode across the open desert. Through the curtain of rain, she could barely make out the landscape, but Kurt seemed to know exactly where he was going, guiding the horse with confidence despite the worsening visibility. By the time the outline of a ranch house appeared through the rain, Violet was shivering uncontrollably, her injured leg throbbing in time with her heartbeat. Kurt rode straight to the covered porch, dismounting quickly before reaching up to help her down. "Let's get you inside and out of those wet clothes," he said, once again lifting her into his arms. Too exhausted and cold to protest the impropriety of his suggestion, Violet merely nodded, her teeth chattering as he carried her through the front door. The interior of the ranch house was simple but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace occupying one wall of the main room. A fire already burned there, tended by an older Mexican woman who looked up in surprise at their entrance. "Senor Kurt, ¿qué pasó?" she exclaimed, hurrying forward. "Found her in Cottonwood Canyon, Rosa," Kurt explained, gently depositing Violet on a worn but clean sofa near the fire. "Got thrown from her horse. She's hurt pretty bad." Rosa clucked her tongue sympathetically. "Poor chica. I will get blankets and hot water." "And the medicine box," Kurt called after her as she hurried from the room. He turned back to Violet crouching beside the sofa. "We need to clean that wound properly, Miss Kingsley. It could fester if we don't." Violet nodded, her eyes meeting his. Despite her predicament, she found herself struck by the kindness in his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Keller. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "Kurt," he corrected gently, "and don't thank me yet. That leg's going to need stitches and it won't be pleasant." Rosa returned with an armful of blankets and clothing. "First, she must get dry," the older woman insisted. "I help her change, then you can tend the wound." Kurt nodded, rising to his feet. "I'll see to the horse and get some more firewood." He paused at the door, looking back at Violet with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You'll be safe here, Miss Kingsley. Rosa will take good care of you until I return." Once he was gone, Rosa helped Violet out of her sodden clothing. The older woman gasped when she saw the extent of the gash on Violet's leg. "My malo," she murmured, helping Violet into a clean nightgown that was several sizes too large, clearly belonging to a man. "But Senor Kurt, he good with injuries. Fix many cowboys, many horses." Violet winced as Rosa helped her back to the sofa, now covered with thick blankets. "Does he have a wife?" she asked, then flushed at the impropriety of the question. Rosa shook her head. "No wife, no family, just Rosa and the ranch hands." She arranged Violet's injured leg carefully on a cushion. "He is good man, but—" She made a gesture that seemed to indicate solitude or isolation. "Keeps to himself since the war." Before Violet could ask more, Kurt returned, his arms loaded with firewood. He added several logs to the fire, then turned to retrieve a wooden box from a nearby shelf. "Rosa, can you make some of that willow bark tea?" he asked, opening the box to reveal an assortment of medical supplies. "And maybe some broth if we have it." "She, Senor Kurt." Rosa patted Violet's hand reassuringly before heading to the kitchen. Kurt pulled a chair close to the sofa and carefully lifted the blanket covering Violet's injured leg. His expression remained neutral as he examined the wound, but she could see the concern in his eyes. "This is going to hurt," he warned her, reaching for a bottle of clear liquid. "Whiskey," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "Not for drinking, though you might want some of that too, but to clean the wound." Violet steeled herself, gripping the edge of the blanket. "Do what you must." Kurt's hands were steady and surprisingly gentle as he cleaned away the blood and dirt from the gash. Even so, Violet couldn't suppress a cry of pain when the whiskey touched the raw flesh. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "Almost done with this part." Once the wound was clean, Kurt examined it closely. "It's deep, but clean now. Needs stitching though, like I thought." He reached for a needle and thread from the medical box. "I've done this before on men and animals both, but I can't promise it'll be pretty." "I'm not concerned with pretty," Violet replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. "Just do what's needed." Kurt nodded, threading the needle with practiced efficiency. "Tell me about Jerome," he said as he prepared to make the first stitch. "What brings a lady like you out to these parts?" Recognizing his attempt at distraction, Violet seized on it gratefully. "My uncle's mine is in trouble. I trained as an accountant in Boston, and he's hoping I can make sense of the books." "An accountant?" Kurt raised an eyebrow, looking genuinely surprised. "That's unusual for a woman." "My father believed women should be educated," Violet explained, then gasped as Kurt made the first stitch. Her fingers dug into the blanket, knuckles turning white. "Keep talking," Kurt encouraged her, his focus on his work. "It helps." Swallowing hard, Violet continued. "After my mother died, father raised me alone. He owned a bank in Boston. When he passed away last year, I finished my studies as he'd wanted, but there wasn't much left after the creditors were paid. So when Uncle Elias wrote asking for help." "You came west," Kurt finished, tying off the first stitch and moving to the next. "Brave of you." "Necessary," Violet corrected, wincing again. "The mine is my inheritance too. I can't let it fail without trying to save it." Kurt worked in silence for a few minutes, his attention focused on the careful placement of each stitch. Violet bit her lip to keep from crying out, focusing instead on the strong lines of his profile as he bent over her leg. "Almost done," he said finally. "You're doing well." "You seem practiced at this," Violet observed, her voice strained but steady. "Army surgeon taught me during the war," Kurt replied, his tone matter of fact. "I was with the cavalry. Arizona Territory mostly, fighting Apaches." Before Violet could respond, Rosa returned with a steaming mug. "Willow bark tea," she announced. "For the pain." Kurt finished the last stitch and tied it off before reaching for a clean bandage. "This should keep it clean while it heals, but you'll need to stay off that ankle for a few days at least." "Days," Violet protested, "but I need to reach Jerome." "My uncle is expecting me." "I'll send one of my hands to Jerome tomorrow with a message," Kurt said firmly, beginning to wrap her leg. "The roads will be washed out after this rain anyway. No wagon could make it through." Violet knew he was right, but the thought of imposing on this stranger's hospitality and being confined in his home, unchaperoned save for Rosa, was deeply concerning. "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Kurt interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. His expression softened slightly as he secured the bandage. "You'll heal here, Miss Kingsley. I promise you that." Something in the way he said those words, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance, made Violet's protests die on her lips. Instead, she found herself studying him more carefully as he packed away the medical supplies. Kurt Keller was a puzzle. His clothing and manner suggested a simple rancher, yet he spoke with the education of a gentleman. His hands were calloused from physical labor, but they'd moved with a surgeon's precision as he'd tended her wound. And though his face showed the hardness of a man who'd seen combat, his eyes held a kindness that seemed at odds with that experience. "Thank you," she said simply, accepting the mug of tea from Rosa. Kurt nodded, standing to return the medicine box to its shelf. "Get some rest. I'll check on you in the morning." As he left the room, Violet couldn't help but wonder what circumstances had led a man like Kurt Keller to live so far from civilization, alone except for his ranch hands and housekeeper. And why the mention of her uncle's name had caused that flicker of recognition, or was it wariness? To cross his face, Rosa fussed around her, adding another log to the fire and adjusting Violet's blankets. "You sleep now, señorita. The tea will help with pain." Exhaustion was indeed pulling at Violet's consciousness, the warmth of the fire and the effects of the willow bark tea making her eyelids heavy. Despite her concerns about her situation, she found herself drifting off, the last image in her mind that of Kurt's intense blue eyes as he'd promised her healing. Dawn arrived with the soft golden light filtering through the curtains of the ranch house, casting warm patterns across Violet's sleeping form. She stirred slowly, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous day came rushing back: the fall, the injury, and the taciturn cowboy who had saved her from certain disaster. A dull throbbing in her leg reminded her of her predicament, but when she cautiously shifted to examine the bandage, she found it clean and white against her skin. No blood had seeped through during the night, a good sign that Kurt's handiwork was holding. The house was quiet except for distant sounds of activity from what she presumed was the kitchen. Carefully, Violet pushed herself up to a sitting position on the sofa that had served as her bed. Her traveling dress, now cleaned and mended, was folded neatly on a nearby chair alongside her undergarments. Rosa's work, no doubt. Testing her injured ankle gingerly, Violet was disappointed but not surprised to find it still swollen and tender. Standing would be impossible without assistance. The realization of her dependence chafed at her independent nature, but she had little choice but to accept her situation for now. The sound of boots on the porch alerted her to someone's approach. Hastily, Violet pulled the blanket higher, ensuring she was decently covered in the oversized nightshirt she still wore. A moment later, the door opened, and Kurt entered, bringing with him the fresh scent of morning and horses. He stopped short when he saw she was awake, removing his hat in a gesture that spoke of good breeding. "Miss Kingsley," he greeted her, his voice formal but not unfriendly. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Better, thanks to your care," Violet replied, self-consciously tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Without her hairpins, her chestnut hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, a state no gentleman outside her family had ever seen her in. "Though I fear I'm still quite incapacitated." Kurt nodded, hanging his hat on a peg by the door before approaching. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her leg. At her nod, he knelt beside the sofa and carefully lifted the blanket to examine her ankle. His touch was clinical but gentle as he probed the swollen area. "The swelling's better than I expected," he remarked, "but you were right to stay off it. Another day or two of rest and you might manage with a crutch." "A day or two," Violet repeated, unable to keep the dismay from her voice. "My uncle will be frantic." "I've already sent Miguel to Jerome with a message," Kurt assured her, replacing the blanket. "He'll let your uncle know what happened and that you're safe. Should reach him by midday." Relief washed over Violet. "Thank you. That's very kind." Kurt rose to his feet, seeming slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Rosa's making breakfast. Are you hungry?" As if in answer, Violet's stomach growled audibly, bringing a flush to her cheeks. "Apparently so," she admitted with a small laugh. The corner of Kurt's mouth lifted in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'll ask her to bring you a tray. After you've eaten, maybe Rosa can help you dress if you're feeling up to it. Might lift your spirits to be properly clothed." The consideration behind this suggestion surprised Violet. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Kurt nodded and turned to go, but Violet called after him. "Mr. Keller, Kurt," she corrected herself when he looked back at her. "I realize I'm imposing terribly on your hospitality. Is there anything I can do to repay your kindness? I'm quite handy with figures, as I mentioned." A peculiar expression crossed his face, something like amusement mingled with respect. "An accountant's services might indeed be useful, Miss Kingsley. But for now, focus on healing. We can discuss repayment when you're stronger." With that, he disappeared into what Violet assumed was the kitchen. She heard the low murmur of his voice as he spoke with Rosa, followed by the clatter of dishes. True to his word, Rosa appeared minutes later bearing a tray laden with food, eggs, bacon, biscuits still steaming from the oven, and strong coffee sweetened with honey. The aroma alone was enough to make Violet's mouth water. "Eat, eat," Rosa encouraged, setting the tray across Violet's lap. "You need strength to heal." Violet didn't need to be told twice. After the trials of the previous day, her body craved nourishment, and she ate with an appetite that would have scandalized her Boston acquaintances. As she finished her meal, Rosa returned with a basin of warm water, soap, and a clean towel. "For washing," she explained. "Then we get you dressed." Senor Kurt, he is gone to the north pasture now, will not return until afternoon." Violet understood the older woman was assuring her of privacy, and she was grateful for the consideration. With Rosa's help, she managed a makeshift bath, washing away the last traces of yesterday's ordeal from her skin. Then, with much maneuvering and occasional wincing, she dressed in her own clothes once more. "Much better," Rosa declared, helping Violet arrange herself more comfortably on the sofa. "Now you look like Señorita again, not lost kitten." Violet smiled at the description. "I certainly felt like one yesterday. Rosa, may I ask you something?" "Of course, chica." "How long have you worked for Mr. Keller?" Rosa's weathered face softened. 5 years now since he buy this ranch. Before that I work for old Don Vasquez who own it before." "And Mr. Keller, he's lived alone all this time." Very private man." Rosa straightened the blanket over Violet's legs. "The war, it changed him, I think. He come back different like many men." Curiosity piqued, Violet pressed gently. "Did he speak of his experiences?" Rosa shook her head. "Never, but sometimes in the night." She made a vague gesture. "Pesadillas, bad dreams, and he know too much about wounds, about death." She crossed herself. "But good man, kind to his workers, fair in business, never raise his voice even when angry." Violet absorbed this information, her interest in her rescuer growing. "And what about his connection to Jerome? He seemed to recognize my uncle's name." At this, Rosa's expression grew guarded. "That is his story to tell if he wishes." She picked up the breakfast tray. "Rest now. I bring you books later, yes. Senor Kurt has many books." With that, Rosa bustled away, leaving Violet with more questions than answers about the enigmatic Kurt Keller. She leaned back against the cushions, her gaze drifting around the room, taking in details she'd been too distressed to notice the night before. The ranch house was solidly built and well maintained, with sturdy furniture that spoke more of comfort than fashion. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that surprised her: classics of literature, history texts, even some scientific works. Not the reading material she'd expected from a frontier rancher. A desk in the corner held papers neatly stacked, suggesting Kurt was a man who valued order. Above the fireplace hung a cavalry sword and what appeared to be a framed commendation, though Violet couldn't make out the details from where she sat. The overall impression was of a home belonging to an educated, disciplined man, one who valued privacy and self-sufficiency. It only deepened the mystery of why such a man would choose this isolated existence. True to her word, Rosa returned with several books for Violet to pass the time. The hours slipped by as she lost herself in the pages of Dickens and Hawthorne, occasionally gazing out the window at the vast landscape surrounding the ranch. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world of vivid colors, the red-orange of the desert soil contrasting with the deep blue of the sky and the green of the vegetation that thrived along what appeared to be a creek winding through the property. It was late afternoon when Violet heard the return of riders. Setting aside her book, she smoothed her hair and straightened her posture, suddenly aware of her appearance in a way that both surprised and flustered her. Kurt entered first, followed by a tall, lean cowboy who hung back near the door, hat in hands. Both men were dusty from their day's work, but Kurt had clearly made an effort to clean up before entering the house. "Miss Kingsley," Kurt greeted her, "you're looking better today." "Thanks to your hospitality," Violet replied, noting how the sunlight streaming through the window caught the lighter strands in his dark hair. "Your books have been excellent company." Kurt nodded toward the man behind him. "This is Jack, my foreman. He'll be riding to Jerome tomorrow with supplies. I thought you might want to send a letter to your uncle with more details than the message I sent today." Violet brightened at the suggestion. "That would be wonderful, thank you." Jack tipped his hat to her. "Madam, boss says you had quite a fall. Glad to see you on the mend." "Thank you, Jack, and thank you for delivering my message." "No trouble, madam. Miguel said your uncle was mighty relieved to hear you were safe. Said he'd been about to send out search parties when word came." Violet felt a pang of guilt at causing her uncle worry. "I should have arrived yesterday afternoon. He must have been frantic." "He understands it wasn't your fault," Kurt assured her. "Jack, why don't you go get cleaned up for dinner? Rosa's been cooking all afternoon." Jack grinned. "Don't need to tell me twice if Rosa's cooking is involved." With a final nod to Violet, he departed. Kurt moved to the fireplace, adding a log to the banked flames before turning back to her. "How's the pain today?" "Manageable," Violet replied. "The tea Rosa made helps considerably." "Good, and the stitches?" His gaze dropped to her bandaged leg. "They're holding well, I think. Rosa helped me change the dressing earlier, and everything looked clean." Kurt seemed satisfied with this. "We should be able to find you some crutches tomorrow. There's an old pair in the barn that belonged to one of the hands who broke his leg last winter." The thought of being mobile again cheered Violet considerably. "That would be wonderful. I hate being such a burden." "You're not a burden," Kurt said firmly. "Accidents happen out here. We look after each other. It's the only way to survive." Something in his tone made Violet study him more closely. "You sound like you learned that lesson the hard way." Kurt's expression shuddered slightly. "Most valuable lessons are learned that way." He turned toward the kitchen. "I should clean up before dinner. Is there anything you need?" Violet recognized the deflection but didn't press. "Some paper and a pen for that letter to my uncle if you could spare them." "Of course. I'll bring them after I've washed up." As he left the room, Violet found herself watching the straight line of his shoulders, the confident set of his stride. There was a story there, perhaps many stories, behind the reserve and self-containment he wore like armor. Dinner that evening was a surprisingly pleasant affair. Rosa had outdone herself with a feast of roasted venison, beans seasoned with chilies, and fresh bread. At Kurt's insistence, the table had been moved closer to the sofa, so Violet could join them properly instead of eating from a tray. The conversation flowed more easily than Violet had expected. Jack proved to be a natural storyteller, regaling them with tales of cattle drives and the characters he'd met during his years in the territory. Kurt was quieter but occasionally offered wry comments that revealed a dry sense of humor Violet hadn't glimpsed before. "Miss Kingsley," Jack said as Rosa served coffee after the meal, "the boss tells me you're an accountant. Don't think I've ever met a lady accountant before." "It's not a common profession for women," Violet acknowledged, "but numbers have always made sense to me in a way people sometimes don't." "Needed more than ever these days," Kurt commented. "With the railroads changing everything, business is getting more complicated. A sharp mind for figures is valuable." "Is that why you keep such meticulous records?" Violet asked, gesturing toward the desk with its neat stacks of papers. Kurt's eyebrows rose slightly. "You noticed that, did you?" "I notice ledgers and account books wherever they lurk," Violet replied with a small smile. "Occupational hazard." For the first time since she'd met him, Kurt laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face, softening the lines around his eyes and revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "Dangerous talent in these parts, Miss Kingsley." Many a rancher and businessman might quake at the thought of a trained accountant examining their books. "Including my uncle, I suspect," Violet said, her smile fading slightly. "His letters have been increasingly evasive about the mine's finances over the past year. It's why I finally insisted on coming to help." A subtle tension entered Kurt's posture at the mention of her uncle. "The silver market's been unstable," he said neutrally. "Many mines are struggling." Jack cleared his throat. "Speaking of struggling, boss, that fence line in the north pasture needs more work than we thought. Might take an extra day or two." The conversation turned to ranch business, and Violet found herself watching Kurt as he discussed water rights and grazing land with his foreman. He clearly knew the territory intimately and spoke with the authority of a man confident in his decisions. As the evening wore on, Violet found her eyelids growing heavy despite her day of relative inactivity. Healing, she was discovering, was exhausting work. A yawn escaped her before she could stifle it. Kurt noticed immediately. "We're keeping you up, Miss Kingsley. You should rest." "I'm fine," Violet protested, even as another yawn betrayed her. "Jack and I have early starts tomorrow anyway," Kurt said, rising from his chair. "Jack, could you help me move the table back before you turn in?" Once the furniture was rearranged and the men had bid her good night, Rosa helped Violet prepare for sleep. The older woman had improvised a nightgown from one of Kurt's shirts, modified with quick but neat stitches to be more suitable for a lady. "Senor Kurt says his mother's trunk is in the attic," Rosa explained as she helped Violet change. "Tomorrow we look for proper clothes for you. Maybe find dress that can be altered." "That's very thoughtful," Violet said, surprised that Kurt would offer his mother's belongings. "Has she passed on?" "Long time ago," Rosa replied. "Before the war, Senor Kurt never speak of her." As Rosa helped her settle back on the sofa, now made up as a bed again, Violet found herself curious about the family that had produced a man like Kurt Keller. "What about his father?" Rosa shrugged. "Dead too, I think. Senor Kurt came to Arizona alone after the war." She tucked the blanket around Violet. "Sleep now, chica. Tomorrow is new day." After Rosa had gone, leaving just a small lamp burning, Violet lay awake despite her fatigue. The house settled around her with unfamiliar creaks and sighs. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the night sky, more brilliant than she'd ever seen them in Boston. How strange life was, she reflected. Just 2 days ago, she had been on a stagecoach heading for Jerome, full of determination to save her uncle's mine and secure her future. Now she lay injured in a stranger's home, dependent on his charity and goodwill. Except, Kurt Keller no longer felt quite like a stranger. In the span of a day, she had glimpsed enough of the man behind the reserved exterior to be intrigued. His kindness, his educated speech that belied his frontier existence, the shadows that occasionally darkened his eyes all formed pieces of a puzzle she found herself wanting to solve. Such thoughts were dangerous, she knew. Once her leg healed, she would continue to Jerome as planned. Kurt would return to his solitary life, and their brief intersection would become nothing more than an anecdote the time she was rescued by a mysterious rancher after a fall. With that sensible reminder firmly in mind, Violet closed her eyes and drifted into sleep, unaware that in a room down the hall, Kurt Keller sat at his desk, a glass of whiskey at his elbow, staring at a worn newspaper clipping that bore the name Kingsley in its headline. The next few days established a routine that became increasingly comfortable for Violet. True to his word, Kurt found her crutches, allowing her to move about the house with growing confidence. Her ankle strengthened daily, and the stitched wound on her leg began the slow process of healing into what Kurt assured her would be a respectable scar. Rosa had indeed discovered a trunk of women's clothing in the attic belonging, Violet now understood, to Kurt's late mother. With Rosa's skilled alterations, several dresses were modified to fit Violet's slighter frame, providing her with appropriate attire during her convalescence. Jack had departed for Jerome with Violet's letter to her uncle, returning 2 days later with a reply. Elias Kingsley expressed profound relief at his niece's safety and assured her that business could wait until she was fully recovered. "Your well-being is paramount," he wrote. "Mr. Keller is known to me as a man of integrity. You are fortunate to have fallen into his care." The letter confirmed Violet's growing suspicion that there was some connection between Kurt and her uncle one neither man had mentioned to her. She debated asking Kurt directly, but hesitated to disturb the easy companionship that had developed between them. For his part, Kurt had gradually relaxed his initial reserve. He took his evening meals with Violet, their conversations ranging from books they had both read to the challenges of ranching in the Arizona Territory. He spoke knowledgeably about the region's politics and economics, but deflected personal questions with practiced skill. On the 4th evening of her stay, Violet sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Kurt joined her, offering a blanket against the cooling air. "Thank you," she said, arranging it over her lap. "It's beautiful here at this hour." Kurt settled into the chair beside her. "It's why I built the house facing west. Never tire of these sunsets. You built it yourself?" Violet asked, surprised. "With help," Kurt clarified. "But yes, to my specifications. The original ranch house was little more than a shack." Violet studied his profile, gilded by the fading light. "You've created something remarkable here. How large is your property?" "About 15,000 acres now," Kurt replied. "Started with 5 when I bought it after the war. Added more as neighboring ranches failed or their owners moved on. That's impressive growth in such a short time." Kurt shrugged, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I was fortunate in some investments, and determined." "Determination I understand," Violet said softly. "It's what brought me west." Kurt turned to look at her then, his expression thoughtful. "You're a surprising woman, Miss Kingsley." Most Eastern ladies would have collapsed into hysterics after what you've endured. Violet laughed lightly. Perhaps I'm not most Eastern ladies. My father raised me to be practical, and after losing both parents, well, one learns to face difficulties with composure. Your mother died young. Kurt asked, his tone gentle. When I was 12. Consumption. Violet pulled the blanket closer against a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Father never remarried. He devoted himself to his business and to ensuring I received the education he believed I deserved. He sounds like an unusual man. He was, Violet agreed, smiling at the memory. Stubborn, principled, and utterly convinced that women were as capable as men in matters of business and intellect. He scandalized our neighbors by teaching me banking practices before I was 16. Kurt's lips curved in a small smile. I imagine you were an apt pupil. The best, Violet confirmed without false modesty. Which is why Uncle Elias sent for me. The mine has been in the family for 2 generations, but its management has always been creative, shall we say. A shadow seemed to cross Kurt's face at her words. He looked away, back toward the setting sun. Mines are complicated businesses. So I'm discovering from my uncle's letters, Violet replied. But I'm determined to untangle the accounts. It's not just about preserving my inheritance. The mine employs half the men in Jerome. If it fails, the whole town suffers. Kurt nodded slowly. Noble intentions. He hesitated, then added, but be careful, Violet. Mining towns have their own rules, their own power structures. Not everyone welcomes outside scrutiny, even from the owner's family. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and Violet felt a small flutter in her chest at the sound of it on his lips. More significant, however, was the warning in his words. You sound as though you speak from experience, she observed carefully. Kurt was silent for a long moment. Let's just say I've seen what greed and desperation can do to men in places like Jerome. He rose from his chair. It's getting cold. We should go in. Violet allowed him to help her to her feet, accepting her crutches from where they leaned against the porch railing. As they walked inside, she couldn't help but wonder what experiences had prompted his warning and why he seemed so reluctant to discuss them. Later that night, unable to sleep, Violet decided to make herself a cup of tea. Using her crutches, she made her way carefully to the kitchen, trying not to disturb the household. A strip of light visible beneath Kurt's study door suggested he was still awake, but she hesitated to intrude. As she waited for the kettle to heat on the stove, Violet's gaze wandered to the desk in the corner of the main room where Kurt sometimes worked on ranch accounts. A leather-bound ledger lay open, along with several documents bearing official seals. Curiosity warred with propriety. It would be wrong to pry into her host's private affairs, yet something about Kurt's earlier warning nagged at her. What did he know about Jerome and her uncle's mine that he wasn't telling her? Before she could resolve her ethical dilemma, the study door opened and Kurt emerged, stopping short when he saw her standing in the kitchen doorway. "Violet," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Is everything all right?" "I couldn't sleep," she explained. "I was making tea." "Would you like some?" Kurt hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. I was working later than I intended." As Violet prepared the tea, she could feel Kurt's gaze on her. The domesticity of the moment struck her suddenly, the two of them alone in the kitchen in the small hours of the night, as comfortable as if they'd known each other for years, instead of days. "Your leg is healing well," Kurt observed as she moved about the kitchen with increasing confidence on her crutches. "You'll be able to travel to Jerome soon." Was there a note of regret in his voice, or was she imagining it? "Yes, though I find I'm not as eager to leave as I perhaps should be," Violet admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. Kurt's expression softened. Ranch life grows on you. It's not just the ranch, Violet said, gathering her courage. It's the company. A flush of color appeared high on Kurt's cheekbones, visible even in the dim lamplight. He accepted the cup of tea she offered, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. I've enjoyed your company as well, he said quietly. It's been a long time since I've had such conversations as we've shared. Violet took a seat at the small kitchen table, and Kurt joined her after a moment's hesitation. For several minutes, they drank their tea in companionable silence. Kurt, Violet finally ventured, may I ask you something directly? He looked up from his cup, wariness entering his eyes. You may ask. I can't promise to answer. Fair enough, Violet acknowledged. What is your connection to my uncle and the Kingsley mine? I can tell there's something you're not saying. Kurt set down his cup carefully. What makes you think there's a connection? Several things. Your reaction when I first mentioned my uncle's name, the way you avoid discussing Jerome. And today, my uncle's letter referred to you as a man of integrity known to him. Violet met his gaze steadily. It seems an unlikely coincidence. For a long moment, Kurt studied her face as though weighing his response. Finally, he sighed. You're right. There is a connection, though it's not one I'm proud of. Will you tell me? Violet asked softly. Kurt pushed back from the table and crossed to the window, staring out into the darkness. After the war, I worked as an inspector for the Territorial Mining Commission, he began. My job was to ensure mines followed safety regulations and reported their production accurately for tax purposes. Violet listened intently, beginning to understand. And you inspected my uncle's mine. Kurt nodded without turning. In '67, what I found was troubling. Safety violations that had led to 3 deaths in the previous year. Falsified production records. Miners being paid in scrip redeemable only at company stores with inflated prices. Violet felt a chill run through her. That doesn't sound like my uncle. He's always been scrupulously honest in his business dealings. He wasn't running the mine then, Kurt said. He'd hired a manager, Gregory Blackwell, while he remained in San Francisco. Blackwell was the one responsible for the violations, though your uncle bore legal responsibility as the owner. What happened? Violet asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Kurt turned to face her, his expression grave. I filed my report recommending heavy fines and a temporary closure until the safety issues were addressed. 2 days later, there was a cave-in. 12 men died. Violet gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. How terrible it was, Kurt agreed grimly. And it could have been prevented if my initial warnings had been heeded. Instead, Blackwell pushed the miners to work faster to meet a shipment deadline. The support timbers they were using were substandard, part of a cost-cutting measure. But surely my uncle couldn't have known. He didn't, Kurt interrupted. When he arrived after the accident, he was genuinely shocked. He fired Blackwell immediately and took over operations himself. He paid for the funerals of the men who died and established funds for their families. Relief washed over Violet, though it was tempered by the tragedy Kurt described. Then why the tension between you? It sounds as though you were both trying to prevent such disasters. Kurt's jaw tightened. Because the official inquiry placed partial blame on my inspection. Blackwell claimed I'd approved the timber supports, that I'd been bribed to overlook safety issues. It was a lie, but there was enough doubt cast that I resigned from the commission before they could fire me. That's monstrous. Violet exclaimed. Surely my uncle didn't believe such accusations. I don't know what he believed, Kurt said wearily. We never spoke directly after the inquiry. I bought this ranch and left mining behind. Violet struggled to reconcile this story with the uncle. She knew a man who had always emphasized honesty and fair dealing in his letters. "There must be more to it," she insisted. "Uncle Elias would never knowingly allow such conditions in his mine." "Perhaps not," Kurt conceded. "But the fact remains that 12 men died, and your uncle's mine has struggled ever since, partly due to the fines levied after the accident, partly due to the difficulty in recruiting miners to a place with such a reputation." Violet's mind raced, connecting this new information with her uncle's increasingly desperate letters. "Is that why he asked for my help? To restore the mine's reputation as well as its finances?" "Possibly. Your presence at Kingsley with a reputation for integrity might help rebuild trust." Kurt returned to the table but remained standing. "I don't tell you this to turn you against your uncle, Violet, but you asked for the truth, and you deserve to know what you're walking into." Violet absorbed his words, grateful for his honesty even as it complicated her understanding of her family's business. "Thank you for telling me. I understand now why you've been reluctant to discuss Jerome." Kurt nodded, his expression troubled. "I've avoided the town since then. My presence wouldn't be welcomed by many who still believe the lies Blackwell spread." "Where is Blackwell now?" Violet asked. "Dead," Kurt replied flatly. "Shot in a gambling dispute in Tucson a year after the accident." A heavy silence fell between them. Violet stared into her now cold tea, processing everything Kurt had told her. The challenge awaiting her in Jerome was clearly far greater than she had anticipated, not just financial records to untangle, but a legacy of tragedy and mistrust to overcome. "I should let you get some rest," Kurt said finally, collecting their cups. "I'm sorry if I've burdened you with this history." Violet looked up at him, seeing the weariness in his face, the weight of carrying this story alone for years. On impulse, she reached out and touched his hand. "You haven't burdened me. You've prepared me, and I'm grateful." Kurt's fingers curled around hers briefly before he withdrew. "You're a remarkable woman, Violet Kingsley. Your uncle is fortunate to have your help." As he turned to go, Violet called after him softly. "Kurt." He paused, looking back at her. "I believe you about what happened at the mine, and when I reach Jerome, I intend to make it known that the current management, my uncle and myself, value safety and honesty above all else." Something like gratitude flickered in Kurt's eyes. "Good night, Violet. Sleep well." As she made her way back to her makeshift bed, Violet's mind was still churning with all she had learned. The task before her now seemed far more daunting and far more important than when she had first agreed to come west. But she was more determined than ever to succeed, not just for her family's sake, but for the miners whose lives depended on the Kingsley mine's proper management. And somewhere beneath that determination was a growing awareness that leaving Kurt's ranch would be more difficult than she had anticipated, for reasons that had nothing to do with her injured leg and everything to do with the man himself. The next morning brought clear skies and a warmth that hinted at the approaching summer. Violet awoke feeling more rested than she had expected after the revelations of the previous night. Her ankle, she noted with satisfaction, was significantly less swollen, and when she tested her weight on it, the pain was manageable. She had just finished dressing in one of the altered dresses when Rosa entered the main room. The housekeeper beamed with approval at Violet's improved mobility. "My buy-in. You are healing fast, señorita. Soon you will not need those crutches at all." "I hope so," Violet agreed, though her feelings about recovery were now more complicated than before. "Where is Kurt this morning?" "Señor Kurt ride out early with the men. Cattle breaking through fence in south pasture. He say to tell you he returned for lunch." Rosa busied herself tidying the room. "You want breakfast now?" "Yes, please. And Rosa, I was wondering, would it be possible for me to see more of the ranch today, Just the immediate grounds, perhaps. I feel I should know more about the place that's been my refuge these past days. Rosa considered this. If you use crutches and go slow, I show you after breakfast. After a hearty meal of eggs and cornbread, Rosa led Violet on a tour of the ranch house and its immediate surroundings. The house itself was larger than Violet had initially realized, with several rooms she hadn't yet seen, including a library that delighted her with its well-stocked shelves. Senor Kurt read much in winter, Rosa explained as Violet examined the collection. Books come by wagon from Prescott, sometimes all the way from California. Outside, Violet was struck by the orderliness of the ranch yard. A vegetable garden thrived behind the house, protected from wildlife by a sturdy fence. The barn, corral, and bunkhouse were arranged with an eye toward efficiency, and everywhere there were signs of careful maintenance. "It's impressive," Violet commented as they rested on a bench near the garden. "Everything is so well planned." "Senor Kurt plans everything," Rosa agreed with a nod. "Always thinking ahead: water for dry season, hay for winter, repairs before they needed. Good rancher." Violet's gaze traveled across the property to where the land opened up into grazing pastures. "And he built all this in just 5 years. That's remarkable." Rosa's expression grew thoughtful. "He worked very hard. Too hard, maybe. Never rest, never celebrate. Just work, work, work. He's alone too much," Violet observed softly. Rosa gave Violet a sidelong glance. "Until you come." Before Violet could respond to this loaded observation, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Kurt and 2 cowboys appeared, driving a small group of stray cattle ahead of them. Even from a distance, Violet could see the skill with which Kurt handled his horse, moving in perfect coordination as they guided the cattle toward a holding pen. There was something magnificent about him in that moment, at one with his horse, confident in his command of both animal and situation. Violet found herself watching him with undisguised admiration. Rosa chuckled beside her. "He is handsome man, no," Violet felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's a skilled horseman," she replied, trying to sound objective. "That too," Rosa agreed, clearly not fooled. "Come, we go inside now. You should rest before lunch." As they made their way back to the house, Violet caught Kurt looking in their direction. He raised a hand in greeting, and she returned the gesture, unreasonably pleased by the smile that briefly crossed his face before he returned his attention to the cattle. Lunch was a lively affair, with Kurt and 3 of his ranch hands joining Violet at the table. The men spoke of the morning's work, the fence repair, the recovered cattle, and plans for the upcoming spring branding. Violet listened with interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed her quick grasp of ranch economics. "You'd make a fine ranch manager, Miss Kingsley," observed one of the hands, a weather-beaten man called Thompson. "Got a head for the business side of things." "Thank you," Violet replied, pleased by the compliment. "Though I suspect the practical skills are just as important." "Those can be learned," Kurt remarked, surprising her. "It's the understanding of systems and planning that's rarer. Most ranchers fail because they focus on cattle but neglect the numbers." After lunch, as the hands returned to their work, Kurt lingered at the table. "How's the ankle today?" "Much improved," Violet reported. "Rosa showed me around the ranch this morning." "You've built something impressive here, Kurt." He accepted the compliment with a nod. "It's satisfying work, tangible results you can see and measure." "Unlike mining inspection," Violet suggested gently. A shadow crossed Kurt's face. "Yes, though I thought that work mattered too once." Violet studied him across the table. "It did matter. Those 12 men didn't die because of your inspection, they died despite it, because your warnings weren't heeded." Kurt's eyes met hers, surprised by her directness. That's a generous interpretation. It's the truth, Violet insisted. And I intend to learn the full truth about what happened when I reach Jerome. Perhaps there's a way to clear your name. That's not necessary, Kurt said quickly. It's in the past. Is it? Violet challenged. You've isolated yourself here, avoided the town where you once worked. That doesn't sound like a man who's put the past behind him. Kurt's jaw tightened. I've made a good life here. Yes, you have, Violet agreed, softening her tone. But wouldn't it be better to have your reputation restored, to be able to go into Jerome without whispers following you? For a long moment, Kurt was silent, considering her words. Perhaps, he finally conceded, but reopening old wounds comes with risks. Are you prepared for what you might find? Violet met his gaze steadily. I am. My father taught me that integrity sometimes requires courage. If there's been an injustice, it should be corrected no matter who was responsible. Even if it was your uncle, Kurt asked, his voice low. Even then, Violet confirmed, though the possibility sent a chill through her. But I don't believe he knowingly allowed those conditions. He must have been deceived by Blackwell as well. Kurt nodded slowly. I hope you're right. He rose from the table. I need to check on the branding preparations. Would you like to see the operation? It's not far and the ground is level enough for your crutches. Surprised and pleased by the invitation, Violet nodded. I'd like that very much. The branding area was set up in a clearing near the main corral. Several cowboys were preparing irons in a roaring fire, while others constructed temporary pens to hold the calves. Kurt explained the process as they watched, detailing the system he'd developed to minimize stress on the animals while ensuring efficient work. We'll start tomorrow, he concluded. It'll take about 3 days to process all the spring calves. It's fascinating, Violet said. So different from banking, yet the principles of good management are similar: planning, efficiency, care for resources. Kurt looked at her with newfound respect. That's an insightful comparison. Few people see the connections between such different worlds. The afternoon sun was warm, and Violet found herself growing tired after the morning's activities. Kurt noticed her fatigue before she could mention it. You should rest, he said. The first day on your feet is always the hardest. As they walked back toward the house, Kurt slowed his pace to match hers. I've been thinking about what you said at lunch, he said after a moment. About clearing my name. Violet glanced at him, noting the thoughtful set of his expression. Yes. There was a mining commission clerk named Hadley who knew the truth. He saw my original report before it was altered. Last I heard, he was still in Prescott. If you're serious about investigating, he might be a place to start. Hope fluttered in Violet's chest. Your report was altered. By whom? I don't know for certain, Kurt admitted. But someone changed my documentation of the substandard timbers after I submitted it. That's why it appeared I'd approved them when the investigation happened after the cave-in. That's criminal, Violet exclaimed. Tampering with official reports is difficult to prove years later, Kurt finished for her. Especially when the mine manager who might have benefited from those changes is conveniently dead. They reached the house, and Violet paused at the steps, turning to face Kurt directly. Will you help me? When I go to Jerome, will you come with me to speak to my uncle? Kurt's expression grew guarded. I don't think that would help your cause. As I said, I'm not well regarded in Jerome. All the more reason to clear your name, Violet argued. And who better to explain the technical aspects of mining safety to me? I'll need that knowledge to ensure the mine operates properly going forward. Kurt hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to put the past behind him and the logic of her argument. Let me think about it, he finally said. There's much to consider. Violet nodded, accepting this non-committal response for now. As they entered the house, she was acutely aware of how their relationship had shifted in the past 24 hours from rescuer and rescued to potential allies in a quest for truth. And beneath that, something more personal was growing, something neither of them had yet acknowledged aloud. That evening after dinner, Kurt surprised Violet by suggesting they play chess. The board was produced from a cabinet, the pieces carved from wood with surprising artistry. "My father made this set," Kurt explained as he set up the game. "He was a cabinet maker in Pennsylvania before he came west." "They're beautiful," Violet said, running her fingers over a knight's intricate details. "Do you remember him well?" "Well enough," Kurt replied, his expression softening with memory. "He died when I was 15, kicked by a horse he was shoeing. But he taught me chess and carpentry and his belief that a man's word should be his bond." "He sounds like someone my father would have respected," Violet observed. They shared similar values. As they played, Violet discovered that Kurt was a formidable opponent, strategic, patient, thinking several moves ahead. She held her own, having learned the game from her father, but found herself admiring Kurt's thoughtful approach. "You play well," he commented after she executed a particularly clever move that put his bishop at risk. "My father believed chess built character," Violet replied with a smile. "He said it taught foresight, consequences, and the virtue of protecting what matters most." Kurt's eyes met hers across the board. Wise man. The game continued, their conversation flowing easily between moves. Outside, the sun set in a blaze of color, casting the room in golden light that gradually faded to the softer glow of lamplight. When Kurt finally checkmated her king, Violet conceded with good grace. "Well played, though I demand a rematch before I leave for Jerome." "Gladly," Kurt agreed, his smile warm in the lamplight. "It's been too long since I've had a worthy opponent." As they put away the chess pieces, their fingers brushed, and Violet felt a jolt of awareness course through her. Kurt seemed to feel it too, his hand stilling for a moment before he carefully placed the last piece in its box. "Violet," he began, his voice lower than usual. The moment was broken by the sudden arrival of Jack, who burst through the door without knocking, his expression urgent. "Boss, there's a fire at the east fence line. Thompson just rode in, says it's spreading fast with the wind." Kurt was on his feet instantly, all trace of the relaxed chess player gone. "Get the men, water wagons, fire breaks." His commands came rapidly as he reached for his hat and coat. "How far from the house?" 2 miles, but moving this way," Jack reported grimly. "Might have been lightning from yesterday's storm, just been smoldering until the wind kicked up." Kurt turned to Violet. "Stay here with Rosa. We'll handle this." "Is there anything I can do?" Violet asked, already rising to her feet despite her crutches. Kurt shook his head. "Just be ready to leave if the fire shifts toward the house. Rosa knows what to take." With that, he was gone, following Jack into the night. Rosa appeared from her quarters, her face lined with worry. "Fuego," she said grimly. "Come, señorita, we prepare just in case." The next hours were among the most anxious of Violet's life. From the porch, she could see the distant glow of flames against the night sky, occasionally flaring higher when they found new fuel. Rosa busied herself packing essential items into a wagon, while Violet, determined to be useful despite her injury, gathered important papers from Kurt's desk, and the valuables Rosa pointed out. Shortly after midnight, they heard the approach of a rider. Violet's heart leaped to her throat until she recognized Jack's voice calling out that the fire was contained. "Boss says it's under control," he reported, accepting the water Rosa offered. "Fire break held. We'll keep watch through the night, but the danger's past. Is anyone hurt?" Violet asked anxiously. "Minor burns, nothing serious," Jack assured her. "Kurt wants you to know there's no need for evacuation now, but to stay ready just in case the wind shifts." Relief washed over Violet. "Thank you, Jack. Please be careful out there." It was nearly dawn when Kurt finally returned, his face streaked with soot, his clothes smelling of smoke and sweat. Rosa immediately set about preparing food and coffee for him and the returning ranch hands while Violet met him at the door. "Is it over?" she asked, searching his exhausted face. Kurt nodded, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Contained. Lost some grazing land and a section of fence, but no cattle and no buildings. Could have been much worse." "You should rest," Violet said, noting the fatigue evident in every line of his body. "After I eat," Kurt agreed. "The men did good work tonight. Followed the plan we've practiced." Violet helped Rosa serve the tired firefighters, impressed by their matter-of-fact attitudes toward what must have been a terrifying experience. When the ranch hands had eaten their fill and departed for well-deserved rest, Kurt remained at the table, nursing a final cup of coffee. "You were prepared," Violet observed, taking a seat across from him. "That's why no one panicked," Kurt nodded. "Fire's always a risk out here." "We practice the response twice a year," he looked up at her. "You and Rosa did well too. I saw the wagon was packed, ready to go if needed." "Rosa knew exactly what to do," Violet said, "and I wasn't going to sit helplessly by." A tired smile crossed Kurt's face. "No, I don't imagine you would." He studied her for a moment, something shifting in his expression. "I've made a decision, Violet. About Jerome. I'll go with you when you're ready to travel. You're right that you'll need someone who understands mining operations and—" He hesitated, then continued with determined honesty. "And perhaps it is time I face the past instead of hiding from it." Unexpected emotion welled in Violet's chest, gratitude mingled with something deeper she wasn't yet ready to name. "Thank you, Kurt. I won't let you regret it." He reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. "I already don't." Rising to his feet with visible effort, he added, "But now I need sleep. We can discuss details tomorrow." As he left the room, Violet remained at the table, her hand still warm from his touch. The events of the night had crystallized something for her, watching Kurt lead his men against the fire, seeing his calm competence in the face of danger, understanding how deeply he cared for this land and the people who worked it. This was a man of true integrity, regardless of what rumors might persist in Jerome, and she was falling in love with him. The realization should have frightened her. It was impulsive, impractical. They had known each other barely a week. Yet somehow, it felt as inevitable as the sunrise now beginning to brighten the eastern sky. Whether Kurt returned her feelings remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. Their journey to Jerome would change both their lives irrevocably. In the days that followed, Violet's recovery accelerated. The branding went on as planned, with Kurt dividing his time between supervising the operation and preparing for their journey to Jerome. Maps were consulted, supplies gathered, and arrangements made for the ranch's management during Kurt's absence. Violet found herself able to discard one crutch, then both, though she still walked with a noticeable limp. The stitches in her leg were removed, revealing a healing scar that Kurt pronounced clean and proper. Their evening chess games continued, becoming a ritual both looked forward to. Sometimes they talked as they played about books, about their childhoods, about their hopes for the future. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the click of wooden pieces against the board. Neither mentioned the moment of connection that had passed between them before the fire interrupted. Yet Violet was acutely aware of a new tension in the air when they were alone together, a sense of possibility hovering just beyond articulation. 1 week after the fire, Kurt pronounced Violet fit for travel. "We'll leave for Jerome the day after tomorrow," he announced over breakfast. "The wagon will be easier on your leg than horseback, though it'll take us longer to get there." Violet nodded, trying to ignore the conflicting emotions his words stirred in her. She was eager to begin the work she'd come west to do, to reunite with her uncle and address the mine's problems. Yet leaving the ranch, leaving this peaceful interlude with Kurt filled her with a strange melancholy. "I've written to your uncle to expect us," Kurt continued. "Sent Miguel with the letter yesterday." Violet looked up in surprise. "You told him you were coming with me." Kurt's expression turned wry. "I thought it best to prepare him for the shock. Our last meeting wasn't exactly cordial." "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that you'd been injured but were recovering well, and that I was accompanying you to Jerome at your request to assist with your assessment of the mine's operations." Kurt took a sip of his coffee. "I also mentioned that you were aware of the accident 5 years ago and my role in the investigation." Violet nodded slowly. "That was wise. No surprises when we arrive. That was my thinking." Kurt hesitated, then added, "I've also written to Hadley, the clerk I mentioned. Asked him to forward any records he still has access to regarding the original inspection." Hope flared in Violet's chest. "Do you think he will?" "If he can," Kurt replied. "Hadley was always sympathetic to my situation. He believed I was made a scapegoat, but he was junior enough that his opinion carried little weight during the inquiry." Violet considered this information carefully. "When we reach Jerome, I want to review all the mine's records, first accident reports, production figures, payroll, everything. If there were safety issues before the cave-in as you reported, there may be a pattern of problems that points to who was really responsible." Kurt nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. Though don't be surprised if some records are conveniently missing. Blackwell was thorough in covering his tracks." "Perhaps," Violet agreed. "But even missing records tell a story, and if your inspection reports were altered, there may be other documents that were tampered with as well." "You'd have made a good detective," Kurt observed with a small smile. "I prefer to think of it as being a thorough accountant," Violet replied, returning his smile. "Numbers don't lie, even when people do." The remainder of the day was spent in preparations for their journey. Violet insisted on helping despite her still healing leg, taking inventory of supplies and reviewing maps of the route with Kurt. Their easy collaboration reinforced her growing conviction that they made an effective team, her attention to detail, complementing his practical experience. That evening, after their final chess game, which Violet won, to her delight and Kurt's good-natured chagrin, they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. A comfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the chirp of crickets. "I'll miss this," Violet said softly, gesturing to the peaceful scene before them. "Your ranch is a special place, Kurt." He nodded, his profile illuminated by the lamplight spilling from the window behind them. "It's been different with you here," he admitted. "Better." Violet's heart quickened at his words. "How so?" Kurt seemed to choose his response carefully. "It's made me see my life through new eyes, made me question whether isolation was really the right response to what happened in Jerome." "And what have you concluded?" Violet asked, barely breathing as she awaited his answer. "That perhaps I've been hiding rather than healing," Kurt said quietly. "That there's a difference between living simply and living alone." He turned to look at her then, his blue eyes reflecting the starlight. "You've reminded me of that, Violet." The way he said her name with a gentleness that belied his rugged exterior sent a warm shiver through her. "I'm glad," she replied, holding his gaze. "Because you've shown me something too, what it means to build something meaningful with your own hands, to take pride in work well done." Kurt's expression softened. "Your father would be proud of the woman you've become." "I hope so," Violet said, unexpectedly moved by his words. "I've tried to live by his principles. It shows." Kurt hesitated, then slowly reached for her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. "Violet, when this business in Jerome is concluded, whatever the outcome, I hope you'll consider returning to the ranch, not as a guest, but—" He trailed off, seemingly unable to find the right words, but his meaning was clear in his eyes, in the gentle pressure of his hand on hers. Violet turned her palm upward, interlacing her fingers with his. "I'd like that very much, Kurt." For a moment they sat thus, hands joined, the promise of a shared future hovering between them, unspoken but understood. Then Kurt raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "We should rest," he said, his voice husky. "Long journey ahead tomorrow." As they rose and went inside, Violet knew that whatever awaited them in Jerome, revelations, recriminations, perhaps even danger, they would face it together. The connection between them, forged in the aftermath of her accident and strengthened through their time together, had become a foundation neither wanted to abandon. The journey to Jerome took 2 days, with an overnight camp beside a small creek. Violet's leg ached from the constant motion of the wagon, but she refused to complain, knowing that Kurt had chosen this slower mode of transportation specifically for her comfort. As they approached the mining town, the landscape changed dramatically. The rolling grassland of Kurt's ranch gave way to more rugged terrain, with the San Francisco peaks visible in the distance. The road wound higher into the Black Hills, following the contours of the land until Jerome itself came into view, a collection of buildings clinging precariously to the mountainside. "It's grown since I was last here," Kurt observed as they drew nearer. "New buildings on the south side." Violet studied the town with interest. Smoke rose from the smelter stacks, and she could make out the scaffolding of the mine works higher up the mountain. Even from this distance, there was a grimy, industrial quality to Jerome that contrasted sharply with the natural beauty surrounding it. "Is that the Kingsley mine?" she asked, pointing to one of the larger operations visible on the slope. Kurt nodded. "The main shaft. There are secondary operations further around the mountain." His expression had grown more reserved as they approached the town, his earlier openness replaced by a watchful caution that reminded Violet of their first meeting. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Kurt's hands tightened on the reins. "Just preparing myself." "It's been 5 years, but mining towns have long memories." "We're in this together," Violet reminded him, placing her hand briefly on his arm. "Whatever happens." He gave her a grateful glance but said nothing more as they entered the outskirts of Jerome. The town was a hive of activity, miners coming and going from their shifts, supply wagons making deliveries, saloon doors swinging open to reveal glimpses of the businesses within. Many buildings bore signs of hasty construction, with unpainted boards and crooked windows, while others showed more careful craftsmanship. As they passed through the main street, Violet noticed people stopping to stare at them, or more specifically, at Kurt. Whispers followed in their wake, and more than one person pointed in their direction. "Word travels fast," Kurt muttered, keeping his eyes straight ahead. "Or Miguel delivered my uncle's letter as promised," Violet suggested, trying to sound more confident than she felt. They turned onto a side street that climbed higher up the mountainside, eventually stopping before a substantial house with a wide porch and decorative trim, clearly one of the finer residences in Jerome. "Your uncle's home," Kurt explained unnecessarily. "The mine offices are in a separate building near the main shaft." Before they could disembark, the front door opened, and a tall, silver-haired man emerged. Elias Kingsley was in his early 60s, with the robust build of a man who'd worked hard all his life. His face bore the weathered look of long exposure to the elements, but his eyes, the same hazel as Violet's, were sharp and clear. "Uncle Elias," Violet called, genuine pleasure in her voice despite the tension of the moment. "Violet, my dear girl." Elias hurried down the steps, his focus entirely on his niece as Kurt helped her down from the wagon. "Thank God you're safe. When your stage didn't arrive, I feared the worst." He embraced her warmly, then held her at arm's length to examine her. "You're pale, and that limp, how badly were you hurt?" "It looked worse than it was," Violet assured him. "Thanks to Mr. Keller's care, I'm nearly healed." At the mention of Kurt's name, Elias's expression shifted, becoming more guarded as he turned to acknowledge the rancher. "Keller," he said, his tone neutral, "your letter was unexpected." Kurt met the older man's gaze steadily. "Mr. Kingsley, I appreciate your willingness to receive me along with your niece." A tense silence stretched between the men, broken only when Violet spoke. "Uncle, Mr. Keller not only saved my life but has been instrumental in my recovery. I've asked him to advise me regarding the mine's operations, given his expertise." Elias's bushy eyebrows rose. "I see." He looked between them, clearly noting something in their manner toward each other. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "Then you are both welcome in my home. Come inside, you must be exhausted from your journey." As they followed Elias into the house, Kurt whispered to Violet, "That went better than I expected." "It's just the beginning," she murmured back. "The real test comes tomorrow when we visit the mine." The interior of Elias's home was comfortable but not ostentatious, with solid furniture and a few quality pieces that had clearly come from San Francisco during his years there. A middle-aged woman, introduced as Mrs. Parker, the housekeeper, showed them to their rooms, Violet to a pleasant chamber overlooking the town, Kurt to a smaller but equally well-appointed room down the hall. After refreshing themselves, they joined Elias for dinner in a dining room dominated by a large map of the Kingsley mining claims on one wall. Throughout the meal, conversation remained carefully neutral, focusing on Violet's journey west, her father's final years, and the general conditions of the territory. It wasn't until they retired to the study for coffee that Elias finally addressed the elephant in the room. "So, Violet tells me you're aware of the accident 5 years ago," he said directly to Kurt, pouring a measure of brandy into his coffee. Kurt nodded. "It's not something easily forgotten." "No," Elias agreed grimly. 12 good men lost, the worst day of my professional life." He turned to Violet. "I was in San Francisco when it happened. Came back to a nightmare, bodies still being recovered, families in shock, the mine in chaos." "And Blackwell," Violet prompted gently. Elias's expression darkened. "A serpent in our midst." "I hired him on recommendation from the owners of the Continental Mine in Nevada. Impeccable references, or so I thought. Yet he managed to operate the mine in violation of safety regulations for months before the accident," Kurt observed, his tone carefully neutral. Elias met his gaze. "Yes. A fact I learned too late, and for which I bear ultimate responsibility as the owner." He sighed heavily. The inquiry afterward was a farce more concerned with assigning blame than determining truth. Blackwell was convincing in his lies, and I was distracted by grief and guilt. "And now?" Violet asked. "What is the mine's current state?" "Struggling," Elias admitted. "We've implemented every safety measure required by the territory and then some. No more accidents, not even minor ones, in the past 3 years. But production is down, costs are up, and investor confidence has never recovered." Kurt leaned forward, his expression intent. Mr. Kingsley, before we go further, I need to ask directly. Do you believe I falsified my inspection report as Blackwell claimed? The room fell silent, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Elias studied Kurt for a long moment before answering. No, he said finally. I did not know you well then, Keller, but your reputation before the accident was unblemished. And in the years since, I've had occasion to review what evidence remained. Blackwell's story never sat right with me, especially after his character was revealed in other matters. Relief washed over Kurt's face, so briefly that only Violet, watching him closely, noticed it. Thank you for that, he said quietly. Elias nodded acknowledgement. I owe you an apology, in fact. I should have spoken up more forcefully during the inquiry, questioned Blackwell's account more thoroughly. But I was focused on the immediate crisis, the family's, the mine's future, my own culpability in being an absent owner. What changed your mind about Blackwell? Violet asked. After he left Jerome, I discovered discrepancies in the mine's financial records, Elias explained. Money missing, supply purchases that never arrived, phantom employees on the payroll. He'd been embezzling for months, perhaps longer. Kurt absorbed this information, his expression thoughtful. That would explain his motivation for cutting corners on safety, more profit to skim from the operation. Precisely, Elias agreed. And when your inspection threatened to expose those cost-cutting measures, he needed a scapegoat, Violet finished. Someone to blame if anything went wrong. Elias looked at his niece with approval. You have your father's quick mind, my dear. Yes, that's exactly what I concluded. But by then, Blackwell was gone, the inquiry was over, and reopening the matter seemed likely to bring more harm than good to the mine's reputation. And now, Kurt asked, why agree to meet with me after all this time? Your letter to Violet mentioned nothing about clearing my name. Elias sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. Because the mine is failing despite all our efforts. Another year, perhaps two, before we're forced to close, and if that happens, Jerome dies with it. He turned to Violet. That's why I sent for you, not just for your accounting skills, but for a fresh perspective, untainted by the past. Violet exchanged a glance with Kurt before addressing her uncle. We want to help, Uncle Elias. But I need to understand everything: the accident, the inquiry, the mine's current operations. No secrets, no omissions. Complete transparency, Elias agreed readily. You'll have access to all records, all areas of the operation. And if Keller's expertise can help save the mine, so much the better. He looked directly at Kurt. Perhaps it's time for both of us to put the past to rest. Kurt nodded slowly. Perhaps it is. Later that night, after Elias had retired, Violet and Kurt met quietly in the small sitting room adjoining their bedrooms. The house was silent around them, the only sound the ticking of a clock on the mantel. What do you think? Violet asked in a hushed voice. Do you believe him? Kurt considered the question carefully. Yes, he said finally. His account of Blackwell's embezzlement makes sense, explains why the safety violations were so extensive, and his willingness to admit his own failure to investigate thoroughly seems genuine. Violet nodded, relieved. I thought so too. The uncle I knew from his letters was always scrupulously honest, sometimes painfully so. It troubled me to think he might have been part of a cover-up. We still need to verify his claims, Kurt cautioned. See the mine's records for ourselves, inspect the current operations. But if he's being truthful about the state of the mine, the situation may be even more dire than you anticipated. Violet sighed, leaning back in her chair. I know, but at least we're facing it together, with a clearer understanding of what really happened 5 years ago. Kurt reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. Together, he agreed. Though I warn you, my presence at the mine tomorrow will cause a stir. Some of the older miners will remember me and not fondly. Let them stare, Violet said firmly. When we're finished, they'll know the truth about your role in trying to prevent the accident. Kurt's expression softened as he gazed at her. Your confidence is a remarkable thing, Violet Kingsley. As is your integrity, Kurt Keller, she replied, returning the pressure of his fingers with her own. For a moment they sat thus, connected by touch and shared purpose. Then Kurt reluctantly rose to his feet. We should rest. Tomorrow will be challenging enough without facing it exhausted. Violet nodded, though she was reluctant to end their time alone together. Good night, Kurt. He paused at the door to his room, looking back at her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. Good night, Violet. Dream well. As she prepared for bed, Violet reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the span of 2 weeks. She had come west expecting to find a struggling mine and an uncle in need of her professional skills. Instead, she had found a mystery to solve, a wrong to right, and a man who had awakened feelings she had never expected to experience. Whatever tomorrow brought, she knew with certainty that her future had been irrevocably altered by her fall in that ravine and the gentle cowboy who had promised her healing. The Kingsley mine bustled with activity as Violet, Kurt, and Elias approached the main office the following morning. Miners arriving for their shift paused to watch them pass, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion when they recognized Kurt. Word of his return had clearly spread through Jerome overnight. Ignore them, Elias advised as they climbed the steps to the office building. Focus on the task at hand. The mine offices occupied a 2-story wooden structure with the Kingsley Mining Company name prominently displayed across the front. Inside, clerks and draftsmen worked at desks arranged in an open room, while private offices lined the perimeter. A large operations map dominated one wall, showing the extensive network of tunnels and shafts that comprised the Kingsley silver mining operation. Elias introduced Violet to the staff as my niece and our new financial advisor, an announcement that generated polite nods but obvious skepticism among the older employees. Kurt's introduction as a mining safety consultant produced more dramatic reactions. Several men exchanged meaningful glances, and one elderly clerk actually gasped aloud. Mr. Harrison, my current mine manager, Elias continued, gesturing to a stocky man in his 40s who approached from one of the private offices. Harrison, this is my niece, Miss Kingsley, and Mr. Keller, whom you may have heard of. Harrison's handshake was firm, his expression professionally neutral despite the obvious surprise in his eyes at Kurt's presence. Miss Kingsley, Mr. Keller. Mr. Kingsley informed me of your arrival. I've prepared the records you requested for review. Thank you, Mr. Harrison, Violet replied. I appreciate your cooperation. We'll use my office, Elias decided, leading them to a large corner room with windows overlooking both the town below and the mine workings above. Harrison, have someone bring us the production reports and accident logs for the past 6 years. Once they were alone, Kurt moved immediately to the window facing the mine, studying the operations with a professional eye. New head frame since I was here last, he observed. And you've expanded the smelting operation. Necessary improvements, Elias confirmed, though they stretched our capital dangerously thin. Violet settled at the large desk, already organizing her approach to the mountain of information they would need to review. I want to start with the financial records from before the accident, she said. If Blackwell was embezzling as you believe, Uncle, there should be a pattern we can identify. And I need to see the safety inspection logs, Kurt added. both before and after the accident. If my original reports were altered, comparing them with the current protocols might reveal what specific changes were made. Elias nodded approvingly. Divide and conquer. A sensible approach. He moved to a cabinet, unlocking it with a key from his vest pocket. These are the most sensitive documents, the original accident investigation, the payroll records Blackwell controlled, and my personal notes from the aftermath. For the next several hours, they worked in focused silence, interrupted only by the occasional question or observation. Clerks delivered additional records as requested, each new stack adding to the comprehensive picture they were assembling of the mine's history and current state. By mid-afternoon, Violet sat back, rubbing her eyes tiredly. "I've found it," she announced. "The embezzlement pattern." Blackwell was clever, but not clever enough. Kurt and Elias moved to join her at the desk, where she had arranged several ledgers and a sheet of calculations. "Look here," she indicated, pointing to columns of figures. Supply purchases recorded at full price, but actual payments to vendors were consistently lower by varying percentages. The differences were distributed across multiple expense categories to mask the pattern. Over 3 years, it amounts to nearly $30,000. Elias whistled softly. "That's a fortune. No wonder he could afford to bribe officials during the investigation." "There's more," Violet continued, turning to another ledger. "Ghost employees on the payroll, men who either didn't exist or had left the mine months earlier. Their wages were being paid directly to Blackwell through a separate account in Prescott." Kurt's expression darkened. "And every dollar he stole was another reason to cut corners on safety. Cheaper timber, fewer support beams, reduced ventilation, all to maximize the profit he could skim." "Which brings us to this," Violet said, producing a document from the accident investigation. "The altered inspection report that implicated you, Kurt. I've compared it with the current safety protocols, and there are specific discrepancies that couldn't be coincidental." Kurt took the document, scanning it with growing anger. "This section on timber supports completely changed from my original report. I never approved the inferior bracing they were using. And here, the ventilation assessment has been modified to suggest I found it adequate when I specifically noted it was substandard." Elias's face had grown increasingly grim as he listened. "Can you prove these alterations? Is there any way to demonstrate that this isn't the report you submitted?" "Hadley," Kurt said immediately. "The clerk I mentioned, he processed my original report. If he kept copies or notes, a knock at the door interrupted them. Harrison entered, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Kingsley, there's a situation developing outside. A group of miners is gathering, asking questions about Mr. Keller's presence." Elias frowned. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests they're not happy about it," Harrison replied bluntly. "Some of them lost friends in the accident. They're demanding to know why the man they blame for it is back at the mine." Kurt's jaw tightened. "This was inevitable. I should speak to them directly." "Kurt, no," Violet protested. "We don't have all the facts yet. We have enough," Kurt interrupted gently. "And sometimes, Violet, confronting the past means facing those who were most affected by it." He turned to Elias. "With your permission, sir." Elias studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're a brave man, Keller. We'll accompany you." The scene outside the office had grown tense. A group of about 20 miners had gathered in the yard, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. The foreman was attempting to disperse them without success. As Kurt emerged onto the steps, a murmur ran through the crowd. Violet and Elias followed close behind, with Harrison and several clerks watching anxiously from the doorway. "Keller," one of the older miners called out, "got some nerve showing your face here after what happened." I understand your anger, Kurt replied, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. I would feel the same in your position. 12 men died because you signed off on bad timber, another shouted. Men with families. Kurt didn't flinch from the accusation. I never approved those timbers. My inspection report was altered after I submitted it, part of a larger fraud perpetrated by Gregory Blackwell. This statement caused a stir among the miners, with several exchanging skeptical glances. An older man with a gray, streaked beard pushed forward. You expect us to believe that? He demanded. Convenient to blame a dead man who can't defend himself. Mr. Jensen, Elias interjected, stepping forward. I understand your doubts. I shared them myself for years. But we've uncovered evidence today that supports Mr. Keller's account, evidence of extensive embezzlement by Blackwell, which he concealed by cutting corners on safety and then falsifying the inspection reports. Jensen looked unconvinced. What evidence? More paperwork that could be manipulated. The numbers don't lie, Violet said, moving to stand beside Kurt. Blackwell stole thousands from the mine, money that should have gone to proper supports, ventilation, safety equipment. When Mr. Keller's inspection threatened to expose these deficiencies, Blackwell altered the reports to protect himself. And who are you? Jensen demanded. Violet Kingsley, Elias Kingsley's niece and a trained accountant. I've spent the day reviewing the mine's financial records from before and after the accident. Kurt addressed Jensen directly. I knew your son, Thomas. He was one of the men who died that day. I understand why you need someone to blame. I've blamed myself for years for not doing more to prevent the accident. But the truth is that all of us were deceived by Blackwell, including your son and the other miners who trusted that the mine was being operated safely. Jensen's weathered face worked with emotion. My boy was 22, had a wife and baby. I know, Kurt said quietly. Nothing can bring him back, but perhaps we can honor his memory by ensuring the truth is known and that such a tragedy never happens again. A tense silence fell over the yard. Then another miner spoke up, a younger man who had been listening intently. I remember you, Keller. You argued with Blackwell the week before the cave-in. I was working the surface then, saw you point at the new timber shipment and call it kindling, not supports. Blackwell laughed after you left, said you were just making trouble. Several miners nodded at this recollection, the mood of the crowd beginning to shift. Jensen studied Kurt's face for a long moment. If what you're saying is true, he said finally, if Blackwell really falsified your reports and stole from the company while putting our lives at risk, there are records in Prescott that might prove it. My brother works for the Territorial Mining Commission. I can write to him. Please do, Kurt encouraged. And I've already contacted a former clerk named Hadley who processed my original reports. Between your brother and Hadley, we may be able to establish definitively what happened. Elias stepped forward again. Gentlemen, I take full responsibility for hiring Blackwell and for not supervising him more closely. That mistake cost 12 good men their lives, and no apology can ever be adequate for that loss. But I give you my word that this mine now operates with the highest safety standards in the territory, and that Mr. Keller's presence here today is part of our commitment to ensuring those standards are maintained. The miners exchanged glances, their hostility noticeably diminished. Jensen gave a curt nod before turning to go, the others gradually dispersing after him to return to their work or head home after their shift. As the yard cleared, Kurt exhaled slowly, the tension visibly draining from his shoulders. Violet moved closer, placing a hand on his arm. That was brave, she said softly. Necessary, Kurt corrected, though he covered her hand with his own briefly. And only the beginning. Jensen's right, we need those records from Prescott to prove what really happened. Elias rejoined them, looking thoughtful. That went better than I expected. Jensen's a respected figure among the miners. If he's willing to investigate further, others will follow his lead. Let's return to our work, Kurt suggested. There's much still to review. The remainder of the day passed in continued examination of records and discussions of the mine's current operations. By evening, a clearer picture had emerged. The Kingsley mine was indeed in precarious financial condition, but not irretrievably so. Production had stabilized at a lower but consistent level. Safety measures had significantly improved working conditions, and the quality of the silver ore remained high. The primary challenges were the high cost of the safety improvements, the difficulty in attracting new investment given the mine's troubled history, and the ongoing debt from the compensation paid to the families of the accident victims. It's not hopeless, Violet concluded as they reviewed her preliminary analysis over dinner at Elias's home. With careful management, reduced administrative costs, and perhaps a modest infusion of new capital, the mine could return to profitability within 2 years. The question is where that capital would come from, Elias pointed out. Banks are reluctant to extend further credit, and potential investors have been scarce. Kurt, who had been listening thoughtfully, spoke up. What about a partnership? Specifically, with the ranchers in the region who supply the mine and depend on the business it generates in Jerome. Elias and Violet both looked at him with interest. Go on, Elias encouraged. The mine doesn't operate in isolation, Kurt explained. It's the economic engine for the entire area. If it fails, every business in Jerome suffers, along with the ranchers and farmers who supply the town. A cooperative investment arrangement where those businesses take a small stake in exchange for more favorable supply terms could provide the capital needed while reducing ongoing expenses. Violet's eyes brightened with understanding. A community-based solution. That's brilliant, Kurt, and it addresses both the financial needs and the trust issues that have plagued the mine since the accident. If local businesses and ranchers have a stake in the mine's success, they become partners rather than just suppliers. Elias considered the proposal thoughtfully. It's unorthodox, but it might work. We'd need to structure the agreements carefully, ensure everyone understands the risks as well as the potential rewards. I can draft those agreements, Violet offered eagerly, and prepare a comprehensive proposal for potential partners that outlines the mine's current state and projected recovery. Kurt nodded, adding, and once the truth about the accident is officially established, assuming Hadley and Jensen's brother can provide the evidence we need, that should help address the lingering concerns about the mine's management. As the discussion continued, Violet couldn't help but admire the way Kurt and her uncle were beginning to work together, their former antagonism giving way to a mutual respect based on their shared concern for the mine and the community it supported. It reinforced her growing conviction that coming west had been the right decision, not just for her family's business, but for her own future. Later that evening, after Elias had retired, Violet found Kurt on the back porch of the house, gazing out at the lights of Jerome and the darker shadows of the mine workings on the mountainside above. "You should be resting," he said as she joined him, though his smile belied any real admonishment. "It's been a long day. Too much on my mind to sleep," Violet replied, settling beside him on the porch swing. "Besides, I wanted to thank you." Kurt looked surprised. "For what?" "For facing those miners today, for being willing to help save the mine despite everything that happened, for suggesting a solution that might actually work." She turned to face him directly. You could have stayed on your ranch and left the past buried, but you chose to confront it instead. That takes remarkable courage." Kurt shook his head slightly. "Not courage so much as necessity. I realized something during our time together at the ranch, Violet. Running from the past doesn't erase it, it just gives it power over your future." The porch swing moved gently as Violet shifted closer to him. "And what future do you see now?" she asked softly. In the silver moonlight, Kurt's eyes were luminous as they met hers. "One I never dared imagine before you fell into that ravine," he answered, his voice low. "One with purpose beyond my ranch. One with connection." His hand found hers on the swing between them, their fingers intertwining naturally. "What about you?" he asked. "Has your vision of the future changed since coming west?" Violet smiled, the warmth of his touch spreading through her. "Entirely. I came expecting to spend a few months sorting out ledgers before returning to Boston. Now I can't imagine leaving Jerome, leaving the work we've begun today." "Leaving me?" Kurt suggested, the question vulnerable despite his attempt at lightness. In answer, Violet leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. It was a brief kiss, sweet and full of promise, but it conveyed more than words could have expressed about her feelings. When she drew back, Kurt's expression was one of wonder and tenderness. "Is that a no?" he murmured, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's a definite no," Violet confirmed, her heart racing at her own boldness. "I'm not going anywhere, Kurt Keller, not if you want me to stay." In response, Kurt cupped her cheek with his free hand and kissed her again, more deeply this time, sealing the promise between them. When they finally parted, both were breathing quickly, eyes bright in the moonlight. "I think," Kurt said after a moment, his voice husky, "that we should revisit that conversation we began at the ranch about you returning there when this business is concluded." Violet nodded, her smile radiant. "Yes, I think we should. Though I'll need to divide my time between the ranch and the mine office, at least initially." "I'm sure we can work something out," Kurt replied, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "The ranch is only a half-day's ride from Jerome." As they sat together beneath the star-filled sky, planning a future neither had anticipated when they'd first met, Violet reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Her fall in the ravine, painful as it had been, had led her not just to physical healing but to a kind of emotional wholeness she hadn't known she was missing. "What are you thinking?" Kurt asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Violet smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "I'm thinking that sometimes what appears to be a disaster can turn out to be the greatest blessing of all." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Hadley, the former mining commission clerk, responded to Kurt's letter with a detailed account of the original inspection reports and copies of notes he had secretly preserved. Jensen's brother at the commission provided additional documentation that, when combined with Hadley's evidence, created an irrefutable case. Kurt's reports had indeed been altered after submission, and Blackwell had subsequently bribed certain officials to ensure the falsified versions were accepted during the investigation. Armed with this evidence, Elias petitioned the territorial governor for a formal review of the case. The resulting inquiry exonerated Kurt completely and placed the blame for the accident squarely on Blackwell's criminal negligence and the corruption of several minor officials who had accepted his bribes. The public vindication transformed Kurt's standing in Jerome. Miners who had once viewed him with suspicion now greeted him respectfully on the streets. Some even sought him out to apologize for their earlier hostility. Meanwhile, Violet's proposal for community investment in the Kingsley mine gained surprising traction. Kurt arranged a meeting of local ranchers and business owners, where Violet presented her detailed analysis of the mine's prospects. Her clarity, confidence, and transparent accounting impressed even the most skeptical attendees. By the end of April, 17 local businesses and ranchers had agreed to the partnership arrangement, providing the capital needed to stabilize the mine's finances in exchange for modest ownership shares and preferential supply contracts. Kurt himself invested a significant portion of his ranch's profits, becoming one of the larger stakeholders. With the mine's immediate future secured, Violet turned her attention to improving its administrative efficiency. She restructured the accounting system, implemented more transparent reporting practices, and worked closely with Harrison to ensure the operational improvements were properly documented and maintained. Throughout this period, her relationship with Kurt deepened. They worked side by side during the day, Violet at the mine office, Kurt consulting on safety procedures and helping implement new ventilation techniques, and spent evenings planning both the mine's future and their own. 1 month after their arrival in Jerome, they sat together in Elias's garden, reviewing the latest production figures from the mine. Silver yield is up 8% this quarter, Violet noted with satisfaction. And costs are down nearly 12% thanks to the new supply arrangements. Kurt nodded approvingly. The safety improvements are paying off as well. Miners are working more efficiently when they're not worried about supports failing or air quality. Violet set aside the reports, turning to face him directly. We've accomplished more in a month than I thought possible when we arrived. The mine is on solid footing, your name has been cleared, and Jerome has a future again. Thanks largely to you, Kurt said, his eyes warm with admiration. Your father would be immensely proud of what you've achieved here. A soft smile crossed Violet's face. I like to think so, and I believe he would approve of my other decisions as well. She took Kurt's hand, including my choice of partner. Kurt's expression grew serious as he gazed at her. Violet, I've been wanting to ask you something. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. I had this made in Prescott last week. Violet's breath caught as he opened the pouch to reveal a delicate silver band set with a small but perfectly clear diamond. The silver, she realized with a surge of emotion, had come from the Kingsley mine. I love you, Kurt said simply, holding the ring between them. I think I began to fall in love with you that first day when you faced your injury with such courage and grace. Every day since has only deepened those feelings. He took a breath. Violet Kingsley, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Joy welled up within her, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Yes, she whispered, then more strongly, yes, Kurt, with all my heart, yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Violet felt a sense of rightness, of completion, that transcended the mere physical symbol. This man who had tended her wounds with such gentleness, who had faced his past with such integrity, who had helped save her family's legacy, he was now to be her husband, her partner in all things. Their kiss sealed the promise, tender and reverent at first, then deepening with the passion that had grown between them over the weeks of working and planning together. When they finally parted, Kurt rested his forehead against hers. I was thinking, he said softly, that we might build a new house halfway between the ranch and Jerome, close enough to manage both, but a place that's truly ours from the beginning. Violet smiled, her heart full. I'd like that very much. A home we create together like the future we're building. The sound of approaching footsteps alerted them to Elias's arrival in the garden. He took one look at their clasped hands and Violet's radiant expression and broke into a broad smile. Well, well, he said, his eyes twinkling. I see congratulations are in order. Violet rose to embrace her uncle. Kurt has asked me to marry him, and I've accepted. Best news I've heard in years, Elias declared, clasping Kurt's hand warmly. Though not entirely unexpected, I must say. You two have been inseparable since you arrived. Kurt returned the handshake with genuine affection. We hope for your blessing, sir. You have it, without reservation, Elias assured him, and I have something that might interest you both. He produced an envelope from his jacket pocket. This arrived today from the governor's office. Kurt accepted the envelope with a questioning look. Opening it, he read the enclosed letter, his expression shifting from curiosity to astonishment. What is it? Violet asked. An appointment, Kurt replied, still staring at the letter. The governor is establishing a new mining safety commission for the territory, with expanded powers to inspect and regulate all mining operations. He's offering me the position of chief inspector. Kurt, that's wonderful, Violet exclaimed. Your expertise would be invaluable in preventing accidents like the one here. Kurt looked up from the letter, his eyes meeting hers. It would mean dividing my time between the ranch and traveling to mines throughout the territory. All the more reason for that house halfway between, Violet pointed out, and I could continue overseeing the Kingsley mine while you're away. She squeezed his hand. We'd be partners in this, as in everything. The doubt in Kurt's expression cleared, replaced by determination. Then I'll accept. It's a chance to make a real difference to ensure no more families lose loved ones to preventable accidents. Excellent decision, Elias approved. Now, I believe this calls for a celebration. I have a bottle of champagne I've been saving for a special occasion, and I can think of none more fitting than this. As they followed Elias inside, Kurt drew Violet close for a moment. Are you sure about this? It would mean a more complicated life than simply running the ranch. Violet smiled up at him. I'm sure about us, Kurt. The rest is just details we'll figure out together. Besides, she added with a sparkle in her eyes, when has anything about our story been simple? Kurt laughed, a sound of pure joy that Violet treasured. True enough. From the moment you fell into that ravine, our path has been anything but straightforward. And yet, Violet said softly, it led us exactly where we were meant to be. 2 months later, on a perfect June morning, Violet and Kurt were married in a ceremony that brought together the entire community of Jerome. The service was held outdoors, on a bluff overlooking both the town and the mountains beyond, with Elias proudly giving the bride away. Violet wore a gown of ivory silk that Rosa had helped alter from one of her Boston dresses, with silver combs holding back her chestnut hair. Kurt, handsome in a new black suit, waited for her beneath an arch decorated with local wildflowers, his expression one of undisguised awe as she approached on her uncle's arm. Their vows, written by themselves, spoke of partnership, respect, and the deep love that had grown from unexpected beginnings. When Kurt promised to cherish her in healing and in health through all the journeys life may bring, Violet felt tears of happiness spring to her eyes, remembering his words from that first night. You'll heal here. The celebration afterward was joyous, with miners and their families, ranchers, townspeople, and even the territorial governor in attendance. The mine closed for the day to allow all employees to participate, a gesture that symbolized the new spirit of community that had emerged from the changes of the past months. As the sun began to set, painting the landscape in the brilliant oranges and purples of an Arizona twilight, Kurt led Violet away from the festivities to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. Happy? He asked, his arms encircling her waist as they watched the colors deepen across the sky. Completely, Violet replied, leaning back against his chest. And you? More than I ever thought possible, Kurt admitted, his lips brushing her temple. When I found you in that ravine, bleeding and alone, I never imagined we'd end up here." Violet turned in his embrace to face him, her hands resting on his chest. "I was thinking about that moment today during the ceremony. How strange that something so painful could lead to such joy." "Life has a way of surprising us," Kurt agreed, his blue eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. "Just as you've surprised me, Violet Keller, with your strength, your brilliance, and your heart." Her new name sent a thrill through Violet. "I like the sound of that," she murmured. "So do I," Kurt replied before capturing her lips in a kiss that promised a lifetime of love, partnership, and healing for both of them, and for the community they had helped rebuild. Epilogue: 5 years later, the house on the hill between Jerome and the Keller ranch stood bathed in morning sunlight, its large windows gleaming and smoke rising lazily from the stone chimney. Inside, the sounds of family life filled the rooms: a child's laughter, the clatter of breakfast dishes, the low murmur of adult conversation. Violet Keller sat at her desk in the study she shared with her husband, reviewing the quarterly reports from the Kingsley mine. The operation had flourished under the community partnership model, becoming one of the most productive and safest silver mines in the territory. Her uncle Elias, now semi-retired but still involved as an advisor, had reported record profits for the 3rd consecutive year. The ranch, too, had prospered under their joint management. Kurt had expanded the grazing lands and improved the breeding stock, while Violet's financial acumen had helped maximize returns and manage investments. They divided responsibilities according to their strengths, creating a seamless partnership that extended from their business affairs to their personal life. A small sound from the doorway drew Violet's attention. 4-year-old Thomas, named for Jensen's son who had died in the mine accident, stood watching his mother, his blue eyes so like his father's, bright with excitement. "Papa's home," he announced. With presents from Prescott, Violet smiled, setting aside her work. "Is he now?" "Then we'd better go greet him, shouldn't we?" Taking her son's hand, she followed him to the front of the house, where Kurt was indeed just dismounting from his horse. As the territory's chief mining inspector, he traveled regularly to operations throughout Arizona, implementing safety standards and training protocols that had significantly reduced accidents and fatalities in the 5 years since his appointment. "There's my boy," Kurt called, sweeping Thomas up into his arms as the child ran to him. "Have you been helping your mother while I was away?" "I helped with the chickens and read my letters," Thomas reported proudly. "And I didn't wake baby Alina even once." "That's my good man," Kurt approved, setting the boy down to approach his wife. "And how is the most beautiful accountant in the territory?" he asked, his eyes warming as they took in Violet's slender form. "Much better now that you're home," Violet replied, stepping into his embrace. Their kiss, though brief in deference to their son's presence, held all the passion and tenderness that had only deepened through 5 years of marriage. "And Alina?" Kurt asked as they walked inside together. "Just waking from her morning nap," Violet reported. "Rosa's with her." "Your timing is perfect, as usual." Their daughter, not quite a year old and named for Kurt's mother, had her mother's hazel eyes and her father's determined nature. Kurt adored both his children with a fierceness that sometimes took Violet's breath away, particularly when she remembered his initial reserve when they'd first met. As they entered the nursery, Rosa looked up from where she was tending the baby. "Ah, Senor Kurt. Back just in time for little one's hungry time." Kurt crossed to the cradle, his face softening as he lifted his daughter into his arms. "Hello, little miss. Did you miss your papa?" The baby gurgled happily at the sound of his voice, tiny hands reaching for his face. Violet watched them together, her heart full almost to bursting with love for her family. Later, after the children were settled for the night and Rosa had retired to her quarters, Kurt and Violet sat on their porch swing, much as they had the night he'd proposed. The valley spread out before them, dotted with the lights of Jerome and the more distant glow of other settlements. "I saw Jensen in Prescott," Kurt mentioned, his arm comfortable around Violet's shoulders. "His youngest son just started at the mine as an apprentice assayer. Jensen said he wouldn't have allowed it 5 years ago, but now he's proud to have the boy working there." "That's high praise," Violet observed. "Coming from him especially." Kurt nodded, absently stroking her arm. "It's hard to believe how much has changed. The mine, the town, the safety standards across the territory." He looked down at her with a smile. "Us. For the better, I'd say," Violet replied, nestling closer to his side. "Though I'm rather fond of how it all began." Kurt raised an eyebrow. "Fond of falling down a ravine and gashing your leg open," Violet laughed softly. "Well, perhaps not that specific part, but I am fond of the cowboy who found me bleeding and bandaged me so gently." She reached up to touch his face, her expression growing more serious. "Who promised I would heal there, and kept that promise in ways neither of us could have imagined." Kurt turned his face to kiss her palm. "Best promise I ever made, best promise I ever kept." As the stars emerged above them, Kurt and Violet Keller sat contentedly together, surrounded by the life they had built, a life founded on healing, truth, and the unexpected love that had begun with a fall and a gentle cowboy's promise.